The cultural history of the mid-1960s is often painted in broad strokes of colorful pop and teenage hysteria. But beneath the surface of the Mop-Top phenomenon, a far more sophisticated and deliberate revolution was taking shape in the very structure of the popular song. By 1965, the Beatles were no longer content with being the world's most successful hitmakers. They were consciously and meticulously reinventing themselves as literary artists. This transformation, which first began to surface during the sessions for Rubber Soul, found its definitive and paradigm-shifting expression in February 1967 with the release of the landmark double A-side single Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever. This was the precise moment where the 3-minute pop song transcended its commercial origins to become a serious, permanent medium for exploring the human condition. These two tracks were not mere nostalgic trips back to their Liverpool roots. They were complex, layered reconstructions of childhood impressions viewed through an adult and often fiercely critical lens. McCartney's Penny Lane offered a vibrant, optimistic engagement with social reality, characterized by a clear-eyed observation of the world outside. In contrast, Lennon's Strawberry Fields Forever provided a languid, psychotropic dive into the internal psyche, bearing witness to a drug-influenced sensorial experience that pushed the boundaries of lyrical expression. Together, they reflected a deep engagement with British intellectual trends of the time, specifically the angry young men movement and the kitchen sink realism that had already redefined British drama and cinema in the decade prior. To understand the Beatles' evolution during this period, one must recognize their transition from simple boy meets girl narratives to a complex mixing of the personal with the social and political. In Penny Lane, for instance, beneath the upbeat tempo, one finds a subtle but unmistakable social critique. The banker who is laughed at by children behind his back and the fireman who hides a portrait of the Queen in his pocket suggest a growing ideological embarrassment regarding traditional patriotism and established class hierarchies. During the mid-1960s, expressions of national pride were becoming problematic for the burgeoning counterculture, a sentiment echoed in the works of playwrights like John Osborne. The Beatles were capturing this shift, where even Remembrance Day poppies and symbols of the monarchy were viewed with a mixture of irony and ambiguity. Lennon's contribution, Strawberry Fields Forever, touched on a different kind of critique, one directed at the blindness of society. By declaring that living is easy with eyes closed, Lennon was echoing the period's intellectual disdain for the delicious sloth of a public that refused to confront the complexities of reality. In both songs, the underlying artistic impulse was clear: to prove that pop music possessed the bona fides of a serious literary medium, an aim they had seen being pursued by influential contemporaries like Bob Dylan and Brian Wilson in the preceding years. As the band moved into the Sgt. Pepper era, this newfound artistic confidence evolved into a full-scale, direct response to contemporary cultural events. This was the first Beatles album to step away from the abstract to directly confront the social fabric of mid-1960s Britain. In songs like She's Leaving Home, they mastered a form of musical satire, using lush orchestral arrangements to mask a biting commentary on the generation gap. This song, inspired by a real story in the Daily Mirror regarding a girl named Melanie Coe, was intentionally overproduced to satirize the pathos of the situation rather than celebrate it. Lennon's caustic counterverses acted as a direct challenge to the cliches of middle-class parental sacrifice, portraying the parents' cluelessness not as a tragedy to be pitied, but as a symptom of a stagnant culture. This same spirit of discontent fueled Good Morning, where Lennon invoked a splenetic energy to attack the quotidian drabness of modern life. The song's concluding stampede of animals chasing down a fox-hunting aristocrat was a symbolic act of class warfare, signaling the band's alignment with the rebellious anti-establishment currents of their time. The culmination of this era was A Day in the Life, a symphonic masterpiece where the act of reading the news became an exploration of existential alienation. By weaving together mundane newspaper reports with a towering, chaotic orchestral swell, The Beatles created a work that questioned the very reality of the media-saturated world, turning the 3-minute pop song into an avant-garde epic. This trajectory of angry individuality reached its most extreme and fragmented form with the release of the White Album in 1968. By this point, the camaraderie that had defined the 1960s was giving way to a harsh, shocking aesthetic of isolation. The album was a sprawling collection of individual visions, often jarringly placed side by side to provoke and disturb the listener. Lennon's contributions were peppered with vitriol, targeting historical figures and mocking the values of the establishment with a sneering contempt that recalled the most bitter literary protagonists of the movement writers. George Harrison joined this social critique with Piggies, a song that went straight for the jugular of the self-satisfied upper class, depicting overfed aristocrats in starched white shirts with something lacking in their eyes. Meanwhile, McCartney tested the bounds of British decency by alternating between sweet, traditional sentimentality and raw, almost obscene rockers like Helter Skelter and Why Don't We Do It in the Road. The White Album was an indulgence in the aesthetics of shock, reflecting a band that was tearing down the conventions of the music industry while simultaneously grappling with their own internal divisions. They were no longer trying to be the unified voices of a generation. They were 4 distinct individuals exploring their own dark corners, proving that rock music could handle themes of class warfare, sexual provocation, and psychological withdrawal with the same seriousness as a classic novel or a piece of high theatre. However, as the decade closed and the Beatles approached their 30s, this fiery, callow anger began to settle into a profound maturity. Their final recorded statement, Abbey Road, stands as a testament to the cooling of this rage. The extreme elusiveness and caustic social critique of the previous years were replaced by a desire for harmony and a reassertion of the value of human connection. The bitter satire was still present as seen in Mean Mr. Mustard, but it was no longer allowed to be the final word. Instead, it was strategically balanced by songs of sincerity, goodwill, and affection, what the band simply called love. Each moment of mockery or irony was followed by a song that celebrated the complexity of the inner life and the necessity of companionship. George Harrison, whose creativity was liberated during this period, transitioned from the bitterness of Piggies to the joyful celebration of Here Comes the Sun. The Beatles proved that as they matured creatively, they saw serious artistic expression as something that transcended fleeting political trends or class interests. It is a poignant irony of history that John Lennon was murdered years later by a man obsessed with the same themes of phonies and teenage angst found in the literature that had originally inspired the angry young men. Yet, the legacy of the Beatles remains one of constant evolution. They proved that a pop group could absorb the most powerful and demanding influences of their time. The anger, the social realism, and the experimental avant-garde, and transform them into a form of art that speaks across generations. They did not just change the music, they elevated the popular song to a level of literary seriousness that remains the benchmark for all who follow, showing us that while anger is a powerful catalyst, the ultimate achievement of the artist is to move beyond that fury and find a deeper, more enduring sense of humanity.